Thank you all. Akilah, thanks for those inspiring remarks. We're going to start by just doing a very brief introduction, and I'll start to my immediate right here. Matt, would you please introduce yourself, tell a little about your organization, and we're so thrilled to be working with you. We've been doing it for a number of years now. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. My name is Matt Farley. I'm the Chief Strategy and Operations Officer for Campus Compact. Campus Compact is a 40-year-old higher education coalition committed to the public purposes of higher education. We really focus on helping college campuses, college universities achieve that public purpose through partnerships with their local communities, and we focus on change making through people, institutions, and field building. And what I mean by that is we focus and spend a lot of time with presidents all the way through students, a lot of faculty, administrators, helping them skill up to be effective change makers in their organizations and in their communities, having those skills that we all need, democratic and civic engagement skills, but also really organizational change skills so they can transform their institutions. We also focus on institutional change by helping campuses build policies, procedures, programs, models, partnerships that really allow them to develop a civic ethos on campus, including driving work like this forward, and service has been the heart of that. And then finally, through our field building work, we really focus on knowledge creation and strategic partnerships like with the museum, and working across the field to really boldly advance higher education's agenda in change making in the world. Solving public problems takes all those things together. It's not just about students volunteering in the communities. That's where we started many years ago. And we're thrilled to be here for a number of reasons. One, because across all those domains that I just mentioned, the 250th really provides an opportunity for us to do deep civic learning on campus, transformational partnerships through faculty scholarship, through student service, with partners in museums and K-12 and civic organizations. And it allows us to really, I think, transform our educational experience by having a big event, a big constant concept that connects the idea of constant learning about a topic, asking big questions, taking action, and deep reflection on things that matter to each of us in our communities.
Thank you, Matt. Pam, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Pam Siebert, Vice President of Community Impact and Evaluation for the National Youth Leadership Council, or NYLC. And if you're not familiar with our organization, we have been around since 1983, and we equip young people with the knowledge, skills, and confidence, amplifying youth voice to co-create a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. The three pillars of our work are service learning, youth voice, and youth leadership. And in particular, through service learning, young people tackle real-world challenges while meeting academic, youth development, and civic learning goals. So it involves service, but there's a whole process around it that helps to ensure that the learning piece takes place. So instead of talking about service projects, we talk about the service process. And it's through that process that young people identify an issue that matches their passion. They take the time to learn about the root cause of the issue. They partner with the community to investigate potential, the needs and potential solutions. They design and then complete the action. And then they need to demonstrate or tell that story to their school or community in some way. And throughout the process, they are reflecting and making adjustments to their actions. So we work with K-12 educators in schools, in after-school programs, and we also work with youth directly. And I'm so delighted that you'll be hearing this morning from Caleb Tsai, who has gone through our Youth Advisory Council. He's gone on to become a mentor, is now a member of our board of directors. Our flagship program is Youth as Solutions, where we work with middle and high school youth and their adult mentors to do service learning in their community and making real change. And they start in the fall and work throughout the school year. And they are choosing an issue that's important to them and then making a difference on that issue. And we're excited to be part of this initiative because of our commitment to lifting up youth voice that we do through also the National Service Learning Conference and specifically student showcases there, through our podcast, The Power of Young People. And we also believe that youth are really important civic actors now. It's not just preparing youth to be making change when they're adults. And then finally, this is a great opportunity to enhance a culture of service in local communities.
Thank you so much, Pam. John, thanks for joining us, and we'll hear about what museums can do as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really a pleasure to be able to be part of this conversation. My name is John Marks. I am the Director of Research and Strategic Initiatives for the American Association for State and Local History, AASLH. We are a national membership association serving the public history community. So among our members are history museums, historical societies, historic sites and related organizations, as well as the staff and often the volunteers who make them run. So a big part of what we do is providing professional development to those staff and volunteers to help them do history work better. We have a national conference and publications, a huge online learning program, but another big part of what we do is research and strategic initiatives. So we investigate the state of the public history field. We explore how Americans are engaging with history institutions and museums. We explore big questions, convene leaders from around the field, bring them together to try to collectively solve problems. And a big part of what we've been doing for the last several years, since I started in 2017, has been helping our field prepare for the 250th anniversary of the United States. So we've been working hard at it for a long time now. I usually joke that no one is looking forward to the 250th more than I am. But we've been bringing people together to try to think about what can this anniversary mean for the field and for the country? How can we leverage this anniversary to make change, to accelerate things that we're already doing, and to change the field and change our society in the years after 2026? So in the early years, a big part of that was just bringing people together around that conversation, but increasingly we've been producing resources to help practitioners at museums and historic sites answer that question and think about how they want to participate in the 250th. A couple years ago, we published a document that we called Making History at 250, the field guide for the semi-quincentennial, which if you haven't seen, I encourage you to check out. We've also produced webinars and virtual summits. Recently, we published a handbook of program ideas for very small organizations to help them think through how they can participate and make the most of this anniversary. And really, a big part of what we are trying to do across all of our work is helping history organizations become more central to their communities, to help members of their community answer questions, solve problems, come together and use history to inform the present and really think about where they want to go in the future.
Thank you so much. Michael DeVaul with the YMCA.
Well, first and foremost, let me say thank you for being here. Akilah wore, I'm also a fraternity member of Omega Psi Phi, so when she had the purple and yellow on, I was like, from the Divine Nine, who else out here? I'm like, I know, I must like her, man. She got our colors on. Michael DeVaul, I am the National Executive Director for Boys and Young Men of Color for the YMCA. Now that may seem odd to you, but here in Washington, D.C. in 1853 was actually the first black YMCA. So there used to be colored YMCAs and then white YMCAs. And I'm going to come back to that in the questions a little bit later, because we do think that creating a usable past, going back to really think about what it is that we can do now, right? The foresight and then the insight. So most of you know the YMCA, hopefully, Young Men's Christian Association. We've been around a little over 170 years. We put Christian principles into practice through programs that build healthy spirit, mind, and body for all. You probably know our pillars: youth development, healthy living, and social responsibility. When we were asked to do this, I think foundationally, if you think about the service by which we provide, is foundational. A couple of things people don't realize about the organization I think is really important to say. When you hear from the Peace Corps, the Y was at the table helping to develop the Peace Corps with John F. Kennedy. When you see the USO, the Y is one of the 6 founding members. So if you look at the 6 stars, the Y is one of the stars for the USO. So it's not just around the programs that we do, and obviously the facilities that we have. It's also around the collaborations that make up the organization. And I'm here hopefully to bring up both the historical nature by which the foundation of the organization was built, but the importance of what we need to do in terms of, particularly today, folks ask me why I'm wearing a hat called belonging, because belonging is what we need. And the reason it's purple is because red and blue make purple. right? Red and blue make purple. So if you mix those together, you can come up with a purple focus. And what we need are more purple policies. Suzanne McCormick, our national CEO, is also a member of the independent sector.
On our board.
Yeah, that's on the board. And I would go back because I think the person who actually brought that to us as a sort of a reinvesting way to focus on service is a guy named Neil Nickel. So Neil was, I think, a former president of that board and re-stimulated why we should focus on service. So my hope is the story that we will tell will focus a little bit on service, but also focus a little bit on collaboration and, most importantly, community building. I do have two colleagues, and I just noticed I see Kayla and Katie out in the audience. So that's who I am. Thank you very much. Can't wait to keep talking.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, I know. You know who I am. Go ahead, Ryan.
Shall I go next? Okay, great. Well, one of the reasons we're here is, the reason we call this 250 and beyond is because the Declaration of Independence has one of the most powerful calls to service ever written. It concludes with, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." And Michael, I know you alluded to the importance of history and actionable history. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists to comment a little bit briefly, but share with us how this history of national service fits with your mission and with our shared goal of celebrating not only the 250 years of history, but making sure the country can do another 250 years going forward. Michael, could you start with that, and then we'll work our way back?
Oh, yeah. So one way we can help is we have 2,700 centers across the country and 700 plus communities. 20,000 staff people and 500,000 volunteers. So why should we be helping is because we can help scale, I think, and spread, but not only the National Museum, but also re-stimulate the power of service moving forward. I do think, too, we should lean into what philanthropy really is, because a lot of times we think of it in the context of money, and service is the ultimate philanthropic activity you can actually get involved in. And I think it's so important as someone who is working with primarily re-stimulating volunteers and communities to focus on boys 11 to 17. We nationally, one of the things that we can do is leverage our database, leverage our systems, but also leverage our history. Our history has a way, some of you may not know that Martin Luther King grew up in a black Y in Butler Street YMCA in Atlanta. And so many times when you look at the institutions that were built, what we have to do is remind ourselves the responsibility that we had years ago when we were building communities and strengthening communities through institutions like the museum. And so our goal would be to re-stimulate that thought process, do more collaboration, and help scale the project nationally.
Beautiful. And John, by definition, you're the organization involved with state and local history. How can we weave the story of service more integrally in what state and local history museums tell? And how can we weave that history and future of service into state and local history museums across the country?
Yeah, I think there's an incredible opportunity here for doing just that. While we're talking about numbers, I always like to mention that there are more than 21,000 history organizations in the United States. With all due respect to my library colleagues, there are more history organizations in this country than there are public libraries. There's also more history organizations than there are McDonald's or Walmart's or Target's. When we were researching this question that seems very simple, but turns out to be incredibly complicated, of how many history organizations there are in the United States, we found communities that don't have a post office, they don't have a stoplight, but they have a local historical society. And so there's this huge capacity for telling stories of service at these kinds of institutions all over the country, and those are the kinds of organizations that AASLH tries to serve. But we also learned when we were researching this question that among the history organizations who are nonprofits, 80% of them have revenue of less than $200,000 a year, which means that about 80% of them are run almost entirely by volunteers. And I think that's a really important and powerful kind of number as part of this conversation, because these organizations are themselves an expression of service, an expression of civic engagement, right? Oftentimes, these organizations were founded, many of them during the 1976 bicentennial, to try to share stories that they felt, that community members felt were being left out of bigger narratives about United States history. And so these organizations are often people just in a community coming together to make sure that their history gets preserved, to make sure that their story gets told in a way that that is appropriate for them. And I think there's this incredible opportunity to use these sites all over the country to tell stories of service from their communities. So many of these organizations, as we've been talking about the 250th for the last several years, have expressed to us that they want to do something for 2026, but they're just not sure what that should be, how they can meet that moment of such a momentous anniversary. And I think the opportunity to tell stories of service of all kinds is a really excellent entry point for many of these organizations. All of their communities have examples of these histories, and their sites can really be important ways, important spaces for telling those stories. But I think about it from the other perspective too, that these sites, because they are so reliant on volunteers and the energy and passion and commitment of volunteers to make the organizations run, there's really an opportunity there too for these to be sites of service as well, not just telling the history of service in their communities, but to be sites of service today as part of this bigger initiative. And so a lot of what we're trying to do through our participation in this initiative and more broadly with our 250th work is to help these small organizations identify potential partners, to facilitate connections between national organizations or state-level initiatives and these very small local groups, and to help them think through how they can be part of these projects and how they can tell these stories.
Wonderful, John. Thank you. It's very exciting. And one of the things that you pointed out is the distributed nature of this. This is not just about a single place in the capital. This is every community in the country has YMCAs, has local. I had more local museums than McDonald's. That's pretty amazing. The other thing every community has is schools. And one of the things we're so excited about, and I want to ask Pam and then Matt about this, is how can we involve the young people in this marvelous 250th celebration in a way that has enduring beneficial impacts? And Pam, can you share with us a little bit about the kind of influence you've seen service have on young people and how we can work with NYLC and Campus Compact to engage our campuses, our faculty, and our students and their families in celebrating and participating in service?
Sure. Well, so at NYLC, we work with K through 12 young people of all ages. And I think one of the things we're excited about, of course, is the learning piece. And through service learning, there are outcomes for the individual young person, but also for the community. And so I think that one of the ways that they are engaging is by looking at what's important in their community, and in this, they would look at the story it's important to tell. One thing I wanted to be sure to mention is that, with young people, it's a continual process because they're growing and now we're working with new young people, so it's something you have to recreate with every generation. We had a cohort this summer working on 9/11 Day commemorations and bringing community together around that, and none of the students had been alive when 9/11 happened. And so it was that through service understanding of history as well as taking action. So a great way to get involved would be, and I think like John said, they can share their story of service, and they could also research and tell the story from their community.
Wonderful. And one of the things I want to emphasize is in the lobby outside, and we'll post this online later on, you see examples of impressive service exhibitions created by students. And we're going to hear from some amazing faculty and students who have created those exhibits, and we will share with you toolkits that have been created by our partner organizations and by us, that anybody watching this today who wants to make this happen in their own community can use these toolkits in their schools, in their history museums, in their libraries, with their own service organization, and create their own local exhibition and displays of service, not just for 250th, but as an enduring contribution to their society for many, many years to come. Matt, same is true about college campuses. Each individual discipline produces alumni, students, faculty, and staff who serve. How can Campus Compact and your network of service learning dedicated colleges and universities participate in this?
Higher education is not a monolith, like many of us know. So really, we've been thinking a lot about and evolving our work to expand the different on-ramps that people take into service. And then how do we tell that story? So I think it's important for us all to kind of, I'm excited to get higher education more engaged in all of my colleagues' work here. And that happens in different ways. And pure volunteerism is one method. And I think, as Brian and I have talked over the last couple of years, we're seeing that work in disciplines, in workforce development, in internships. How do we embed these concepts throughout the university? How do we do that better? And then how do we link to larger concepts beyond kind of that self-benefit of the piece? So we still fundamentally need to drive that work forward as our core mission. But I also want to concur, that there's opportunities for students in this moment to answer a call in a different way. I mean, I appreciate the fact that you grounded us in that initial declaration call, that people answer different calls. I found that over time, and that one call does not meet the needs of all. So how do we, help all of us understand and then encourage others? So motivating them not just to respond to the call, but to call to others, I think is fundamental for all of us, but certainly for college students. Because peer-to-peer engagement, as we know, is such a transformational part of this process. So that's got to be core to this. So I just want to stress that for us, we see that as, student-centered work, having their voice at the table, not necessarily kind of only having their voice, but really how do we bring them in as equal partners in decision-making and really to advance our work together.
Yeah, and I think that's so true for history organizations in particular, right? One of our really big kind of pillars, or our two big pillars for our involvement in the 250th has been to use this anniversary to tell a more complete and more inclusive story about the American past, and to use this anniversary to strengthen the field for the next generation. And I think involving young people can be really instrumental in bringing both of those about. If we're able to better facilitate connections between young people and their local history organizations, they can bring new perspective to the table and help these organizations tell stories in new ways. But also, these places, like I said, are mostly run by volunteers, but many of these volunteers are from older generations, right? The kind of caricature of the elderly museum docent is grounded in reality in some way, and there aren't as many young people as we would like to see involved in these volunteer efforts. And so I think 2026 is an opportunity to really kind of build partnerships between youth service organizations and history organizations to try to solve some of those problems and strengthen things going forward.
So I heard a lot about storytelling and narrative, and I've learned a lot just from sitting here. Right? I learned how many history organizations there were, and I do come from a library of librarians, so that was very interesting to know there are over 21,000 in this country. We talked about how our civic organizations help to shape the minds of some of our greatest leaders, right? And how they're helping to transform young people and, character development. How would you say, what do you think your needs are around sort of narrative, right? Like, how do we tell the story of service in our nation? How do we get more young people involved in service? How do we reach them? In some ways, I would love for you to share what you've been doing in terms of how do you get your narrative out there? But I also would like you all to share, what do you need in terms of narrative development? How do we tell this collective narrative of service and volunteerism in our country that sometimes we don't hear enough about? I invite all of our panelists, one of our panelists to start.
Oh, maybe I'll leap out here. One is, the one thing I would focus on is the WHY, teaching young people why we do things. Programs are problems that should solve, they're interventions that solve problems. One of the things I get real focused on is if you look upstairs, we have a program called Youth in Government that was started in 1936 so that the generations would understand why democracy would be really important. It's not enough to put them in a program. You really have to ask them, why was this program created? And why was it created historically? What would be the importance of it? I would say also, I would name some skills, what we would need. What I see across the country is helping our young people understand the importance of compassion and accountability. Those are skills you need, and why that is important in policy development. I think you've got a great report that maybe, I may not get the number right, but 39% of nonprofits are basically leading with advocacy and policy change. We need to re-stimulate that. Why is it that we're in policy, practice, and programs? It's because programs should influence policy, right? Practice should influence policy. So I would go back to remind young people the importance of when we were building these institutions, why we did them. What was the reason things got created that you may have to reimagine in your own real time to rethink it. I'll just say one thing before I turn it over. Anthony Bowen created the first colored YMCA in 1853. He did that because his father was also friends with John Brown. So the things we try to remind young people is we were building amongst the races, in spite of the fact that the Fugitive Slave Act was created in 1850. In 1853, he was still building. And so I think it's really important to remind young people that even in an era where we see polarization everywhere, acting and building against the narrative is the most important thing you can do, is to see the narrative, but then get involved in countering the polarization narrative. But by building and rebuilding and reimagining institution, right? It is a usable past. And you can think about how we built it before and how we might build it differently going forward.
So I just wanted to add before I invite the other panelists, thank you for referencing our report, Retreat from Influence. I encourage you all to go to our website and download it. What we found out, just to give you the statistic here, 31% of nonprofits across the board, and there are about 1.5 million of us, are participating in some level of advocacy, local, state, or federal. That number has dropped by almost half. It used to be 60% over 20 years ago. So we are retreating and leaving a lot of power on the table. And so I encourage you all to download that report. But you talked a lot about a term we use called Sankofa, where you can take stories from the past as a way to build for the future. So I would love for the other panelists to sort of weigh in on that. Like, how do we continue to tell the stories of our institutions and use that story and narrative as a way to build and invite more young people into our movement? John?
You all are speaking my language when it comes to looking back to move forward. I think an important part of that, what we've learned in researching how Americans think about history, how they engage with history, is really the importance of grounding things locally. Oftentimes people think about history as something that's nice for hobbyists and people who are into that kind of thing, but not something that's essential for solving problems, not something that is really important for everyone in society. And one of the ways that history organizations and historians and other people who are presenting the past to public audiences can try to counter that is to really ground these stories in something local, right? That helps people draw these connections to see why it's relevant to their lives today. Emphasizing that local connection can be a really important part, a really important element of helping these stories hit home for people. And I think what we also see across the country, despite where the kind of broader discourse has gone, most people want to see a more complete, a more inclusive story about American history, about their own community. People don't want a partisan version of history. They don't want to see just the good or just the bad. They want a version of this story that is exploring history in all of its messy complexity. And I think that's really a way that young people especially can be brought into these conversations and can really be instrumental in helping history organizations better connect to the people in their communities to help them, to help history organizations solve these challenges or work with community members to inform contemporary conversations is by really taking this broad and holistic view. And research that we've done, work that other history organizations have done, has really demonstrated that that is what people want, and people who are trying to convince you otherwise, are not presenting it in a truthful way.
Pam.
So I would say, so part of the process of service learning is demonstration. Part of the learning process is for students to share out what they've learned. So there's a really natural connection there. And a lot of times they are able to tell their story really well in their local community. And what we try to do is lift up all of those stories and weave them into a national one. And we just did this reminds me, we did a couple of focus groups just at the end of August saying, what more support can we give you? What do you want from us? And we were focusing on, do you want stickers or banners or badges? And what the adults and the youth told us was just the opportunity to be connected to a national network of other youth and adults who think like us was the most important thing they wanted. So we really are focusing on helping them tell their story and then bring it together nationally.
Belonging, right? It comes back to belonging and how do people see themselves in our history and in our future? I mean, I think we have a responsibility as educators and as civic organizations to help bridge the gap in so many ways. And most of life doesn't happen on a field trip or on a visit to the library, et cetera. And I've been thinking a lot, actually, we had some questions in advance. I've been thinking about those things, but now I'm going to change this entirely and say, I want to think about my experience going back, say, 10 or 15 years ago, where I'm working full time, I'm in grad school at night, I'm coaching my kids' teams, I'm on the PTA, all these different things. What resources were there for me to help me bridge the gap to ask better questions with my kids? To have an easy win to get them to I happen to know more probably than the average citizen because of my, work in higher education and with civic groups, but I think about my peers in those ways. So we're gonna bring young people to the table, but they need to not be in isolation. They are not in isolation. They need to belong and they need to be connected. We actually have a bigger intergenerational opportunity in this moment to actually teach everyone how to ask better questions and to listen better. And by listening better, I think then we can understand and be open to other ideas. I remember being dragged as a little kid around the Freedom Trail in Boston and to every plaque, and I feel like upstate New York and all these things that was not living history to me as a child, right, as a youth. So how do you bring history into the moment? And I appreciate kind of the efforts here to think about that work and integrate it. If it's not integrated, it's not going to last. Yeah. And if we're going to have a lasting change, we need to figure out multiple ways to tie things together, including relational concepts.
One of the things that I find so exciting about this panel and about the people I see in this room, when we set out, the focus was how can we create exhibits that honor service so that one day some person is walking by, maybe it's a young person in school, maybe it's a retired person, maybe it's a business executive, and says, wait a second, I can do something. And we really were initially focused on how do you create exhibits to make that effect. But one of the things we've learned, and I'm seeing it here again, is the process of thinking about how we create service exhibitions brings people together. It brings students together in schools. It brings institutions together. If you visit the Anthony Bowen YMCA that Michael DeVaul's talked about, it's like a service museum. There you are lifting weights and there's a Frederick Douglass quote above you. If you walk down a school hallway or past the office or something, there should be stories of service. If you're in a history museum, but we can bring together the YMCA, the K-12 schools, the colleges and universities, the history museums, the libraries, all together as communities, unifying the community, telling the most positive stories there are to tell. That's pretty uplifting to me, and I've learned from each and every one of you today. Akilah, any final questions or comments from you?
No, Congressman, like you said, I think this is the right conversation to have. I will just say that volunteers are extremely important when we think about the nonprofit sector. We think volunteerism is important just for the soul of individuals. It's one of the very things we can do in this society that people aren't particularly paid for, that just brings them intrinsic joy. And as the mother of 3 school-age children, I know I'm always trying to impart those values to them about doing things just because they bring you intrinsic joy. But one thing we also realized is that volunteering also helps strengthen nonprofit organizations across this country. When volunteers work align with local nonprofits, they're more likely to join boards. They're more likely to become donors. They're more likely to start working for those nonprofits. And so volunteerism is a huge pipeline for the 1.5 million nonprofits across this country who count on the energy of volunteers to be able to fulfill their mission. So that's why I'm really excited about this panel. So in our last few words here, because I know we're going to get a sign any minute that says we have 5 minutes left, what words of wisdom would you share, 1 or 2 words or sentences to, as sort of last things you want the audience to think about as it relates to service and volunteerism?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think I would emphasize that history organizations are really grounded in this ethic of service, right? I think history organizations increasingly take a cue from our colleagues in the library sector of not just being places where you go and see exhibits or not just being an archive, but of being centers and forums for important community conversations, for sites where people can come together and be informed by the past to talk about the present and the future. And I really hope that the 250th can be an opportunity for history organizations through partnership, through outreach, through engagement, to really lean into that part of their work and to come out of this anniversary revitalized and re-energized, with new partners and new audiences, and really set up to continue to engage in that hard work for the next generation.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, think about involving your local school and after-school programs, because with the youth, even if they haven't lived through that history themselves, as Matt said, they can be really good at asking questions, and it could be really a win-win for the community and then for what the young people are getting from being involved in that experience as well.
I'd say we have to meet people where they're at. I think that, and I mean that in 2 ways. I think that's a place-based concept of bringing these stories to people, and because not everyone gets to a museum or a library, but they can be, if you meet them where they're at, they can be on-ramps to come to the next spot. So how do we then have invitations that link, right, to get people to the next step? I also think when we meet people where they're at, we're really conscious about who's telling the story, and that it's not just about a bunch of white guys, to be clear, and our history, but also it's a collective history. And so our storytellers matter more than ever. And it's important for us to really be mindful about how we invest in those storytellers.
Thank you.
I would just close with add purpose. I think our young people in particular are looking to arrive on purpose and where their own story aligns with what it is that they're trying to solve. And that alignment is what keeps it enduring, right? And then passes down through the generations. I have 2 young men, 2 boys that are 28 and 31, and I'll ask them, what are you going to do about it? Don't just complain. Democracy is an active sport. You must get engaged. You don't have to engage in everything, but choose something that you will do and do it. Stop talking about it, because the equity is in the action.
Excellent. The one thing I want to just summarize is I want to honor somebody from our group. We had a youth advisory panel in the National Museum because we think it's so important to hear their voices. And I asked one of our early members, what would you, if you were a young person looking at an exhibit of service, what would you want to see? And he gave me a 1-word answer: success. I want to see that we can do something that makes a difference. And I'm thrilled that that young man is with us here today. He's named Arjun Mandati. Arjun, would you stand up, please? Arjun was one of our early youth advisors. And Arjun's the young man who said, Arjun, the reason he's in that attire, he's now going to the Naval Academy. And he took time from that studies and work to come down here. But that notion of success, when we first started this, people said, how could you possibly succeed at such an audacious vision of having service exhibitions in every school and community in the country and a signature national building? After hearing this panel and getting to meet all the people here, how could we possibly not succeed? We're going to make this happen. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, panelists.